What we want to talk about here today is extremely complicated. It's called hate speech. It's complicated by a number of different factors. There is what's going on college campuses right now. As some of you know, areas of microaggression and these sorts of things, the understanding about what hate is there, to the international sphere, where actually heresy, blasphemy, offensiveness, and those sorts of ideas are chiefly generated by the countries where they have criminalized what they call heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, etc. So this is going to be necessarily a bit, I'm going to try to cover a lot of terrain in a short period of time and give you a little bit to think about in each of four areas. First of all, there's a definitional problem, there is a political problem, there's a psychological problem, and there's a theological problem. So we're going to look at those four areas. And again, as I said, we're in a sense only dipping because there's a lot to be considered, especially when we get to the theological problem. I have a little quote that seemed appropriate. We've all heard the phrase, silence is golden. I didn't know that there was a first part to that saying. Speech is silver, silence is golden. And then, of course, this is from a book and then a film of the 60s, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Mary, are you listening? Maggie Smith says this, kind of the grumpy old dowager in Downton Abbey, when she was very young in the 60s, was Miss Jean Brodie. And she has a lot to learn, and she unfortunately has to learn a lot of it the hard way in the film. But we'll tie this in as time goes on. But speech is silver, silence is golden, and it's a very interesting little phrase, and we'll come back to it. But my thesis is simple. It is asserted by contemporary human rights theorists and others that criminalizing hate speech will reduce discrimination against racial, ethnic, religious, and sex groups. My argument against this assertion is that, on the contrary, over time, criminalization will breed more violence than current American law does. The argument comes in four parts, as I just said. We have a definitional problem, which from the outset, I think, cripples the further arguments regarding politics and the psychological problem. But anyway, we're going to cover those four areas. All right. What we see here is a misrepresentative of Genesis 1, 24 to 26. I draw your attention to the sign held by this erstwhile segregationist of the early 60s. She is referring to the passage, the part of the passage that refers to each according to its kind. Imagining that African Americans are a different species from white Americans. It's a foolish mistake and the result of heretical beliefs being imposed upon the text of Scripture. However, it's the sort of projection that hate inspires among those who should know better. Kind means species, not race. It's a very simple solution. What is hate? From our tradition within the church, hate is a vice as opposed to a virtue. It opposes the virtue of love specifically. It is love gone wrong. Unlike love's other opposite, indifference, hate's an active perversion of love. Rather than rejoicing when any good comes to its objects, hate loathes the good that comes to them. As the lover of my wife, all good that comes to her, she's right here, all good that comes to her is a cause of rejoicing for me. When evil comes, it's a source of sorrow. For the one who would conceivably hate her, out of envy, malice, who knows what, any good that comes to her would be a source of sadness. For example, in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, some rejoiced in the new educational and relational possibilities that would ensue for African Americans and whites. Others loathed the decision for precisely the same reasons, that African Americans would have increasing opportunities for education and for friendship with everybody. Love or hate was the root of the rejoicing and the loathing. Hate was the same with regard to those who celebrated after the destruction of the Twin Towers on September 11th. Those of us old enough to remember can't forget the white parents seething with rage as Ruby Bridges was escorted by federal marshals into her new school in New Orleans. Love manifests a mature, healthy mind. Hate reveals an immature, even wicked mind. Virtues and vices are ensembles of inner perceptions, affections, and desires, cultivated into habitual ways of thought and action. They are, as C.S. Lewis said, stable sediments of affection or disgust, wisdom or cunning, courage or cowardice, hope or despondency, faith or scorn, etc. The hatefulness displayed by the parents who found school desegregation loathsome not only manifested the mendacity of their disordered souls, but also their heretical beliefs. In Christian doctrine, the belief in ethnic superiority is a heresy concerning human nature. I don't know if I can say that emphatically enough, but I've gotten used to it. God made all human beings to be morally responsible for their thoughts and actions. Animals are not. You and I have to wear clothes, for example. We are moral beings. If animals were human beings, they would have to be clothed. And during the late Victorian period, some decided that that needed to happen, but the plan didn't work very well. Anyway, very inconvenient. But the fact that all human beings can be held morally accountable, it's part of our nature. And everyone in the South was held morally accountable. That fact alone should have explained very carefully and very specifically that African Americans are, even by their haters' account, held to be morally responsible for their actions and should have been known to be equally human. Instead, hate deranges the minds and disorders the souls of those who hate it. What the haters uttered by giving voice to their hatred was quite literally a blasphemy against the human nature shared by all human beings, including African Americans. Heresy and blasphemy have been punished throughout history by almost every society around the world, including our own colonial period. Even though the concepts have endured secularization, the U.S. is now often criticized for being the only modern state not to criminalize speech about contemporary heresies and blasphemies concerning racial, ethnic, and religious hatred. Yet the Supreme Court, in its most recent decision on these matters, in Mattal versus Tam, resisted the steady pressure of other states as well as international human rights monitoring bodies by writing, and this is by Justice Kennedy, who loves to go to Strasbourg to the the European Court of Human Rights in the summer and be feted and taken to very expensive Le Crocodile and other nice restaurants. But he writes this: the idea that the government may restrict speech expressing ideas that offend strikes at the heart of the First Amendment. Speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar ground is hateful. But the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express, quote, the thought that we hate, unquote. He penned these words, and all the justices agreed on this constitutional principle. It was a unanimous decision. The state is not a trustworthy arbiter of what is and is not heretical or blasphemous. The principle is so firmly locked in American constitutional doctrine that it stands firm even though the expression of heresy and blasphemy offends many people, even when offensive speech is scandalous. The harm of scandal is that it causes some people to stumble, stagger, and perhaps to fall. The Hebrew is kashal, and the noun is mikshal. The Greek is unsurprisingly, skandalizo. The noun is scandalon. Even when heretical and blasphemous speech scandalizes people, that is, it's designed to bring about people's downfall or stumbling or to cause them to sin even. It is not criminalized unless it directly incites violence or is calculated to bring about physical danger. The doctrine of speech liberty is grounded in even deeper doctrines concerning human nature. First, Americans aren't subjects of a sovereign. Americans are not subjects of a sovereign, but rather citizens of a republic. In clans and tribes, religious and secular states, the people are ruled by a sovereign, and their proper relation is as subjects to the sovereign. The distinction was highlighted by Justice James Wilson's opinion in an old case, Chisholm versus Georgia, where he argues persuasively that the word sovereignty is absent from the text of the Constitution. In response to Georgia's claim of state sovereignty and consequent immunity from lawsuit, Wilson reasoned that in a sovereign state, people are subjects of the state, whereas in a republic, quote, sovereignty is in the man, meaning mankind, humanity, men and women. Sovereignty is in the man. In a republic, we are citizens, not subjects. When citizens are sovereign, they determine what is heretical, blasphemous, and scandalous, not the state. Furthermore, the First Amendment protection of speech liberty is actually intended to guarantee that the majority cannot silence the minority by imposing tests of political orthodoxy, declaring what is heretical, blasphemous, or scandalous. Second, the doctrine of speech liberty is closely associated with religious liberty, and that protection is far older still. Contrary to popular belief, it began in the early church, first with Tertullian, who mentioned it in the midst of Christian persecutions, but most eloquently by Lactantius in his Divine Institutes. Here he defended Christianity against the Emperor Diocletian's bloody persecution of the church, as well as arguing for a general policy of speech liberty, which was finally adopted by the Emperor Constantine. Briefly, Lactantius interprets the pagan Cicero as arguing that the deities will punish false religion. Real deities would reject human coercion to manipulate worship of the divine because force opposes the spirit of religion by corrupting it with violence. And that purity of mind is more important than ritual. So what a deity wants is devotion, faith, and love, sentiments that do not arise in response to force. Lactantius, in seeking to connect with someone in the Roman pantheon of great thinkers and great men of Rome, turns to Cicero. Because the Diocletian persecution is a persecution in order to bring us all together. The Roman gods are angry. That's why we have all these people, these tribes are trying to ruin us. Diocletian is arguing, of course, against Celtic, because there are Celtic invasions, Gothic invasions, Huns are invading, all kinds of people are invading. And Rome is in decline because it has not been attendant to its gods. And so to bring about domestic purity, get everyone on the same page, unify the empire, they decide that what they have to do is undertake a persecution of those who do not and are unwilling to participate in this state religion. Cicero had argued against it, and Lactantius, in the midst of this persecution, the most grim of any of the persecutions, he decides to tap into Cicero. And he declares it as a principle of natural law that there be no persecution of religion, because, as I said earlier, real deities don't need humans to manipulate the worship of the divine. And purity of mind is more important than the outward rituals that the Caesars wanted, in other words, to sacrifice to Caesar and all of that. What a deity really wants is devotion, faith, and love, which will not come in response to violence. As a theologian, Lactantius could have added that God himself suffers heresies, blasphemies, and slanders, and that it's his exclusive right to judge and punish them. Third, Cicero and Lactantius both believe the religious liberties and speech liberties that are derived from these principles of natural law. Well, there's a sentence there. Because human beings are capable of discerning the proper end or truth of their nature by reason, they should be left to do it alone and in concert with each other. Here, the moral psychology of natural law is supremely at odds with the moral psychology of those who would ban hate speech, and we're going to come to that in just a moment. Perhaps the strongest objection to such protection of speech liberties is that the Constitution was penned in the 18th century before the vast propaganda machines of the 20th and 21st centuries. A similar objection has been raised against the protection of the Fourth Amendment. Flintlock rifles have given way to automatic weapons, so the right to bear arms has become an antiquarian concern. Do we not need to protect those who can be harmed by the powerful engines of hatred as we need to protect them from today's powerful weaponry? Well, technology is not neutral, and we must always work to think about the ways that it changes everything. It would certainly be easier for the state if we would surrender our sovereignty to them for our protection, to surrender the power of citizens to determine the nature of truth and the rightful ways of discussing and expressing it, as well as to surrender the power to protect ourselves against the state and its massive modern weaponry. Probably isn't possible anyway. Speech is not an absolute power, and neither is the possession of firearms. However, both are doctrines that focus on the constitutional amendments as they are rooted in nature, specifically in human nature, and they are designed to protect human flourishing against the encroachments, specifically of the state. Okay, let's get to the political problem. I'm going to run out of time here. I love this one. But anyway. Oh, no. We'll leave that one there. All right. The political problem. And this is a map of blasphemy laws in the world. Pretty good size. A new Pew Research Center analysis finds that as of 2014, about a quarter of the world's countries and territories had anti-blasphemy laws or policies, and that more than 1 in 10 nations had laws or policies penalizing apostasy. The legal punishments for such transgressions vary from fines to death. Perhaps if we turn to Europe, where hate speech legislation is multiplying rapidly, perhaps they will have some experience that we don't have, and we can find assistance with coming up with a definition. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. The definitional problem is as pesky there as it has been here. There, too, advocates have all but given up on an objective test for hate, a way to know objectively that this speech is hateful or that speech is hateful. So they create subjective tests that are attentive to how speech makes people feel. In law, there are 2 kinds of tests depending on what's at stake and what's being contested. Some have objective tests, some have subjective tests. Unfortunately, Western law has moved increasingly towards subjective tests, so that creates a kind of trajectory for these advocates to follow. But what is at stake in Europe is as much what is at stake here. The issue becomes one of who determines orthodoxy and thus bans heresy, identifies and then bans what is heretical, blasphemous, and scandalous. Most of the discourse, as you've heard earlier today, regarding hate speech has been generated by the UN, particularly by the Oversight Committee for the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the CERD, which is the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Both committees are composed of experts from around the world who often imagine that their expertise is not to be challenged because they're appointed by states where their views are ascendant. Most hate speech discourse arose first in Soviet complaints during the discussion regarding Article 19 of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which you heard about this morning, where they sought to forbid what they called fascist speech. The Russians, as you probably know, were horribly massacred throughout World War II. Anything to do with fascist speech, they wanted banned. The Russians, by the way, did not ratify the UDHR, Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and they abstained, as did the Saudi Arabia and the states allied with them. They sought to forbid what they called fascist speech. They lost because Europeans and North Americans insisted that the Universal Declaration protect even offensive and intolerant speech. However, subsequently, and I'm not going to read everything here, but just to give you a flavor, this book is on sale out there. I did not write it. I get nothing from this. I wouldn't do this if I had. What is hate speech? When used in legal parlance, the colloquial expression hate speech seems to presuppose that the state can define with legal precision the particular forms of content that should be regulated as hate speech. From the European Court of Human Rights, there's an admission that there is no universally accepted definition of the expression hate speech. From the European Court of Human Rights, we have the, quote, the identification of expressions that could be qualified as hate speech is sometimes difficult because this kind of speech does not necessarily manifest itself enough through the expression of hatred or of emotions. It can also be concealed in statements which at first glance may seem to be rational or normal. The European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance had this to say: hate speech is advocacy in a public context of the denigration, hatred, or vilification of a person or group of persons by reason of race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin, other personal characteristics, beliefs, sexuality, or status, as well as the glorification of persons for having committed atrocities against such person or group of persons. Again, a difficult legal standard to understand. I would recommend that if you want to find out more about how this is playing out in Europe, that you read this book. This author, Paul Coleman, has spoken to our students in France. He works also for Alliance Defending Freedom, the same as our earlier speaker, the same organization. He is located in Vienna. So, what's changed over time is that resolve, particularly in Europe. Oh, that's the end of something I wanted to say. Okay. The Europeans, in other words, joined with the Americans and the Canadians in resisting what the Russians wanted to do and others wanted to do to limit the power of speech liberties in the UDHR. What has changed over time is that that resolve in Europe has dissipated. The reason is the ascendancy of an unproven psychological theory that if states disallow hateful speech, their subjects will slowly lose their hate, and it will not be multiplied to their progeny. I call it a theory because it's not the result of empirical scientific experimentation, much less of reasoning or experience, conscience or imagination, empathy, or any normal means by which we arrive at real knowledge. It's assumed and rarely argued for. In particular, courts have not relied on any normal reasoning or studies in rendering their decisions regarding what they call hate speech. I want to get on to that psychological problem. The political problem is chiefly characterized by the fact that we are frequently vilified now in international fora as the only modern state that has not criminalized hate speech. And so that is a political problem. We are the only, probably for reasons that you would understand from the previous talk this morning, we are the only country. It used to be the only country, along with Somalia, which was a failed state, that hasn't ratified the Convention for the Rights of the Child. Perhaps you will understand now why we might not have done that, because the so-called experts on the committee measuring compliance with that organization is really working avidly to dissociate parental rights. In addition to that, we would have to federalize all child services, and in a country of 350 million people, you can imagine what a great idea that is. That's the political problem. The psychological problem is, as I have said, is this theory that if you silence hatred, it will somehow disappear, something with any credibility? It seems to me more likely that it's a strategy almost designed to cultivate and exacerbate the very vices it seeks to eliminate. Astonishingly, advocates of criminalizing hate speech don't cite social science research findings. Why? Because of the definitional problem. They don't know what it is, and so they don't know how to study it. The reason is that since hate has been notoriously difficult to define, it is therefore very difficult to study. Most advocates for establishing norms for heresy, blasphemy, and scandal, and offensiveness now, have little more than vague assertions that hate speech leads to violence. Without the possibility of a universal definition, they are compelled to rely on subjective responses. How I feel about your speech. Your speech made me feel this way. I felt insulted. I felt abused. I felt harmed. Without the possibility of this definition, this is the direction it goes. For example, speech liberty has been associated by some. I didn't want to talk about that. Okay. There's an older moral psychology, it seems to me, that is more informed, and it's associated with the moral psychology that goes with what was called natural law. It was premised on a remarkably robust understanding of the virtues. I want to dig into one little corner of this moral psychology by examining one of the passions that causes hate: indignation. Indignation, or nemesis in Greek, from the root nemo, means to allot or apportion. Indignation is the sorrow or pain one experiences when an undeserving person receives a benefit. Indignation is a proper response to undeserved good fortune, in the same way that anger is a proper response to injustice. Indeed, indignation is part of a continuum of responses in general to rivalry, the rivalry that is at the root of all that happens to us when imitation goes bad. We are, I don't want to get too deeply into this, but we are basically imitative creatures. We imitate others. This is one of the characteristics of being made in God's image, because we are made to imitate Christ. But imitation often goes wrong, even if it's someone who is worthy of being imitated, like St. Paul or others in our own time. When it goes wrong, it leads, unfortunately, into envy, resentment, blame, hate, and malice, and then to violence. It seems that to try to cut this off at speech, when there's all the rest of this involved, is unrealistic at best. We can't have laws against envy that are enforceable in any reasonable way. Resentment, blame, hate, malice, and then, of course, we can deal with violence. Rivals are ubiquitous. That means they are everywhere all the time. And many people are increasingly incapable in our day of dealing with the differences between us. In psychological terms, I call it pluralization fatigue. In Orange County, when my aunt and uncle bought a house over in Anaheim in 1955, there were 3 language groups in Orange County: Spanish, English, and a little bit of Japanese. There are now well over 125. This is a sociological distinction. Pluralization is simply a sociological description of what's happening. It has nothing to do with pluralism, which is an ideology. I'm simply describing the fact that the more we have to adjust ourselves and deal with people, over time there's a kind of fatigue that begins to set in, and it gets harder and harder, and that makes the problems of rivalry gone bad, the problem of indignation, become more intense. It seems to me that focusing on this sort of thing, and perhaps it would even behoove the people who control the media organs of entertainment to deal with this in a more sophisticated and intelligent manner, that might actually do more good than going to the speech and focusing on that. But anyway, the fact that at no time in history have there been so many radically diverse voices in close proximity, clamoring for recognition and influence, it seems to me, even in the Roman Empire, where there was enormous pluralization, where it led was to scapegoating. In the case of Diocletian and many other emperors, the scapegoats were Jews and Christians, particularly Christians. And the reason that you scapegoat is to return the society to its unity. It's their fault. And everyone joins up and goes, yeah, it's their fault. And so off we go. And once we've blamed them and dealt with them, then we all feel better. Because, of course, there are always going to be anxieties in any society. But the problem is that the people at the top never want to take any of the responsibility for it. So they call for a scapegoat. We do this in families. We do this in schools. We do it all kinds of places. It's just a sort of pattern, an observable pattern. And when you get lots of people who are really different together, and people get fatigued from that constant stretching and stretching, how do we talk to them and to them and to them? Then after a while, what begins to happen is this resentment begins to build, blame, bop, bop, bop. The last administration was an expert in blame, and it seems to have been passed along. All right. Rightly ordered people who are wise, loving, and just. I get that phrase specifically from J. Bojaschewski. The rightly ordered human mind is the way he likes to put it. Properly experienced indignation, and then they direct it by reason, by love, by faith, by hope. In other words, they deal with it virtuously. They say, well, there has been an unjust reward. How are we going to think about that? What are we going to do about that reasonably? Unfortunately, what we get is a lot of frothing at the mouth and other sorts of things, which is not the result of rightly ordered, wise, loving, just souls. Increasingly, we hear advocacy for the wedding of offensive. Oh, I don't want to go there either. All right, the theological problem. Here we return. Oops. Well, I'm not going to go back there. Silence is golden. Speech is silver. Silence is golden. Are you listening, Mary? We return to that quotation. Two of the major reasons for Christians to promote speech liberties are, generally, to protect reason in public discourse for everyone. And specifically, number two, to protect our own speaking reasonably about the nature and implications of Christian faith in public discourse. Number one, we want to protect everyone's ability to participate reasonably in public discourse. And secondly, it is on our own best self-interest because we live in a sinful world where people want to silence us all the time. And most groups ought to be able to realize that as well. Speech is silver, and Christians are compelled to protect its free expression because people in power seem to have a penchant to want to extend their power over others, often by imposing laws against what they call blasphemy, apostasy, scandal, and offensiveness. On the other hand, silence is golden. Christians are forbidden to be offensive in our speech. It doesn't mean we don't say in reason and in love that we disagree with somebody. But we are forbidden to be a cause of stumbling. And this is the tension in the theological reflection that we have to do on this. We're not to engage in speech that speaks lies about other human beings, their race, ethnicity, or religion. That's why I started where I started. The church, some people in the church, heretically, spoke lies about other people, about race and ethnicity. In my estimation, speech liberty is more a tragic necessity in many ways due to sin. I always call it these sorts of legislative things a sin tax, and the play on words is intentional. The taxes are a sin tax. Taxes are sort of the common language of government. It has to have money, but it's also a sin tax, because a lot of what government has to do is spend a lot of its time trying to keep people from hurting each other. So it's a tax on sin, but it's also the sin tax of political discourse. Christians have an obligation to speak to the issues of our time, so we need the protections of being able to say what we believe and why we think that it has implications for public life. And so that's the more, shall we say, self-interested issue. That Christians are commanded never to offend others because it may cause them to stumble in the faith or in their search for the faith is well known. This is from St. Paul's Corinthian correspondence, shall we say. They must intend always to speak the truth in wisdom and love. They seek to discern and express nothing but the truth about real things, and they believe that such truth is knowable. They believe that all human beings are made in the image and likeness of the living God and therefore are worthy of respect for their God-given dignity. I'm thankful to my colleague for making this point last night. Therefore, speech that demeans or harms others with untruth is forbidden. And this is what I mean by harmful speech. I have a theory. I'm working on it. The reason I want to be careful with it is because a lot of people with much better minds than mine in the past have understood this passage differently. Nevertheless, I'll take a chance. The passage reads, "For those are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not, for the sake of dishonest gain. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, 'Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.' This testimony is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply." Normally, that passage is intended to be an agreement on the part of St. Paul that that's what Cretans are like. Of course, people seem to forget that Titus is in Crete when he writes this letter, and I don't think that's quite what he means. I've never been satisfied with that interpretation. This testimony is true. Well, does it mean that Cretans are always liars, that that's the testimony? Or that it is found in the subsequent passage, "Therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth." The people who were asserting this in Crete, or as the Cretans say, Kreta, were the people involved in the circumcision, the party of the circumcision, or what we've often called Judaizers. You had to, in their belief, you had to obey the entire Jewish law in order to be a Christian, even if you come in as a Gentile. St. Paul has dealt with that in a number of fora. Here, what he's doing is saying, it seems to me, something quite different than most people think. He is saying specifically, this guy who's a prophet, and therefore has some office in the church, actually said this. And that sentence actually refers to a sort of incredulous response. Which is why he then says, "Therefore, rebuke them sharply that they may be sound in the faith," etc. I think what we actually have here isn't a general admonition not to offend others, but is rather a specific command not to believe or proclaim untruths regarding other peoples. In the Corinthian correspondence, what St. Paul is dealing with there is person-to-person offenses regarding things like what you eat and meat sacrificed to idols and those sorts of things. This, I think, is a different thing. Every group, ethnic, racial, well, race, not then, race, ethnic, sex, etc., has stereotypes in the minds of others, some more than others. And in this case, Cretans were apparently stereotyped as being of a particular sort. And it seems to me Paul is going, do you people not realize that all kinds of stereotypes are told about Jews? And what he's telling Titus to do specifically is to rebuke them for believing these stereotypes about Cretans or stereotypes about anybody. And insisting instead that the belief in any kind of ethnic elitism, including Jewish elitism, as well as anti-Semitism, is not allowed among Christians. We take people as they are, as God's image. They haven't lost it, as we heard last night. It hasn't been smashed, crumbled. We mar it by our behavior and by what we cultivate in ourselves. But it seems to me that the Cretans were known for being a certain way, that a guy who holds an office in a church repeats it in that place. Apparently lots of Jewish people living in Crete at that time. It's part of the diaspora. And the church is propagating this myth, and Paul wants to put it to a stop in very strong language. Rebuke them sharply that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to these things, to the pure. All things are pure, etc. I don't want to go on into the rest of the interpretation of this passage, but interestingly, what are Cretans known for today? Why is everybody going to Crete? You know about longevity zones? When you're my age, you do. Where are the places that you might have a chance of living longer? How is it that these people live so long? And there's a part of, a number of people in Crete is part of the longevity zone, and they've been invaded. I met a fellow from there in Strasbourg a few years back. He said, we've been invaded by research institutes. There's an island off the south end of Japan, Loma Linda, for obvious reasons. There are these longevity zones. That's what Crete's known for today. None of this. It reminds me of a sermon I heard many, many years ago where the preacher, Earl Palmer, up in Berkeley, said, here you have St. Paul, this little funny-looking guy, and he goes on and describes him. He's before Nero, and goes on and talks about the grandeur of the Roman emperor, and on, and he said, and yet today we name our sons Paul and our dogs Nero. It was a delightful point. Anyway, the desire to make others stumble will cause people to stumble themselves. That's part of what Paul argues. Indeed, the wicked, quote, are so addicted to evil that it's become their sedative by night and their food and drink by day. That's from Bruce Waltke commenting on Proverbs chapter 4, verses 10 to 19. Another great place to look at something on stumbling. So, to conclude, some of what's labeled hate speech is simply boorish, insulting, vulgar, rude, and ignorant. It lacks refinement, which is interesting in itself, especially because in the last 50 years in popular culture, the organs of mass entertainment have been committed to flaunting social norms regarding boorishness, vulgarity, and rudeness. With an image reminiscent of C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, university professors and artists have filled the culture with vulgarity, and now they expect it to have produced ladies and gentlemen. They've neutered propriety and expect speech without disparagement and intimidation. They've made the horses of decorum into geldings and now insist that they procreate. Instead, we should focus our attention, where appropriate, on specific forms of speech that should be included in the very short list of unprotected speech. And I'll give one example of where I think this is appropriate. Intimidation. An objective test was offered in a U.S. Supreme Court decision concerning cross-burning. In Virginia versus Black, Justice Clarence Thomas penned an elegant dissent, arguing that due to its context as a means of terrorizing African American communities by the Ku Klux Klan, cross-burning is intrinsically linked to terror and intimidation. Thus, it is speech that was not intended to express anything but intimidation and is therefore not to be protected. While the rest of the court hemmed and hawed, Justice Thomas wrote, quote, "A conclusion that the statute prohibiting cross-burning with intent to intimidate sweeps beyond a prohibition on certain conduct into the zone of expression overlooks not only the words of the statute, but also reality," unquote. That reality was and is that burning a cross on the lawn means be silent or else. It is a species itself of silencing. Questions? I'm not like some preachers coming in for a second landing, you know. You think they're coming in for a landing at the end of the sermon, they bounce and they take off again? Anyway, Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think your comments about the American constitutional approach to this were very helpful and on point. There's a great book by Akil Amar on the Constitution, which I recommend to everyone. And he points out that the reason why America is different in this respect is because, you know, our rights in our Bill of Rights are written in the negative. Congress shall make no law prohibiting freedom of speech. And one of the things that went into the formation of the First Amendment was that libel laws were used in Great Britain basically to punish people who had viewpoints that were unpopular. And that the major purpose, or one of the major purposes of the First Amendment, was to prohibit the ability of the government to prohibit speech that wasn't considered to be acceptable to the Crown. And I just want to compliment you and say, I think looking at it in a historical context, you're exactly right.
I will be happy to admit that I came home from Strasbourg about 10 years ago burbling about maybe there is some speech that is hateful and we ought not allow it, and you were the one who talked me out of it. So anyway, I've had to give it a lot more thought since then. Yeah, I think that the wisdom of the common law is such that it takes speech or anything else, any other contention, any other rival claim, and says, what are we talking about in this specific instance? And what are the principles from the Constitution that prevail based on the doctrines that it comes from? And as a result, the point of protecting speech, I'd refer you to a YouTube interview with Lisa May, the Prime Minister, something May, Mrs. May, Theresa May in England. There's an interview with her from 2 years ago on the new hate speech legislation, and she's, as a conservative, defending it. And her whole line is, they're trying to disunify us. They're trying to drive a wedge between us. And no matter what the interviewer, who is obviously antagonistic to this legislation, suggests, she keeps scurrying back to the unity that's necessary and maintaining social cohesion. This was not the framers' concern at all. which is why sovereignty never shows up in the Constitution. And that's exactly what Diocletian argued. We can't have this division in our society. We have to get everyone on the side of the gods by, sacrificing and doing all the things that we need to do. We've got to get everybody on the same page, and then maybe the gods will bless us and defend us against all these invaders.
I'm a public school administrator, and with the topic of immigration at the forefront of K-12, all the way from kindergarten to high school. Knowing that church and government it's a separation between church and government, and we cannot bring God's divine word to be able to teach our children and our students about indignation. Because I'm sensing a lot of indignation in public school. And so, what are some of the suggestions that you have so that we adults, or we can provide a forum where we can teach our students, we can model for our students, that we don't have to show that hate, that indignation, that resentment in order to bring change into their own life, and also what you were talking about, your own public discourse and everybody's public discourse.
Yeah. Well, briefly on your assumption about separation, we have to remember that the one who penned the letter to the Danbury Baptists up in Connecticut, Thomas Jefferson, who said that there will be a wall of separation, himself attended church where? Where did he go to church when he was the president? Where did they meet? In the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Somehow there was no disconnect for him. He went the whole time. He didn't believe it. He acknowledged that he didn't, although he was quite insulted when someone asserted, they encountered each other and had a chat when he was on his way to church. He was insulted that when the guy said, "Why are you going to church? You don't even believe it." He says, "Well, this is what presidents should," and he was quite, miffed about the whole thing. He went to church in the Capitol building. He didn't seem to think that there was, some big deal. So, can we teach what Herman Melville's worldview was in public schools? You bet. You can talk about theism. Teachers imagine that they're going to be, that somebody's going to kill them if they happen to mention, but you can't understand Moby Dick or the Scarlet Letter if you don't or anything that happened before 1960 that doesn't have some Christian component to it if you're talking about anything in the United States or the UK or any place else in the West. So, number one, we can and we should be taking opportunities to do that, carefully and prudentially. I'm guided by wisdom. Well, there's a lot of stuff on character education, and I've read a lot of it. I worked at one time for a woman at the Department of Health and Human Services evaluating character-based sex ed curricula. She was in charge of all that. And she wanted my doctorate's in ethics, so she wanted an ethicist to examine it and evaluate what was out there. And some of them were actually pretty good, and most of them weren't ethics-based or character-based at all. It seems to me that what we have to do is we have to return and try to go back to figure out what it is. What are the virtues? What are the vices? What is their relationship? And it'll sound very judgmental, but to be able to identify a vice is a very important thing. And Os Guinness has published a couple of things on the virtues and vices. I think they were published by NAV Press. They're probably not in print anymore, but I have mountains of things on this. I've spent almost my whole life studying it because it seems to me that that's the core of the way we think about it. Resentment is I think we need to read actually Nietzsche on ressentiment and the ways that he writes about it. It's slightly different from what we mean by resentment, but it's pretty much the same. He was pretty dismissive. We were talking about Immanuel Kant last night. He said, Kant, he's the great delayer. In other words, he delayed the West from actually facing what it means to have killed God. You've killed God, and now what are you going to have? What do you have left? Resentment, envy, blame, and the strong will seize the moment, and the weak, they're just cattle. Sir?
I had a question. You touched on intimidation being a form of unprotected speech.
Could be, yes.
We see that also in, I think, witness tampering. I'm not an attorney myself, but you can't, dissuade a witness from being subpoenaed or testifying accurately in court.
I think we probably have, my colleague here teaches criminal law. I think we have pretty good protections on that in place.
Yeah, that there are clearly federal statutes and state statutes as well, which would criminalize intimidation of witnesses in trial. It's also an obstruction of justice.
Right. So, watching the news and seeing campus protests, a term that I've heard fairly frequently is this term gaslighting. And for anybody who doesn't know the definition, I just looked it up on Wikipedia really quick. Gaslighting is a form of manipulation that seeks to sow seeds of doubt in a targeted individual or in members of a targeted group, hoping to make them question their own memory, perception, and sanity, using persistent denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying. It attempts to destabilize the target and delegitimize the target's belief.
Probably pretty good guidelines for psychological manipulation for psychologists.
So,
But it's probably not a very good policy for the campus.
right, so that's kind of what I was questioning was, because they seem like they're related concepts. You can't tell somebody they can't speak. And I think what these protesters are saying is that by somebody going and presenting at a school, that it's causing them to question their own beliefs and not believe those things that they believe. So where is a good kind of breaking point between those two ideas?
I would say if you don't want your beliefs challenged, don't go to college. Really. Really. That's the point. The point of college is, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, to learn about the democracy of the dead, to go and listen to the past, and not just the people who are speaking now. And if your beliefs are... I started college in, I'll date myself, that's fine, 1968. And that was the most delightful part of it, was that everything that I was suspicious about a lot, but I didn't know how to think about it. I went away to college and it just blasted everything. It was great. The problem, this particular problem, again, is there is only one group. I mean, let's be honest. There's only one group that really wants to make this a crime. And the reason is because they don't want that belief challenged. There are others tangentially. For example, in the same way that the UN Council for Human Rights wants countries to come in every 4 or 5 years to listen to their criticism, so do all of the treaties. Each treaty has a committee that it puts together to monitor compliance with the treaty. And so countries like the US send in a report on civil and political rights in the United States, and then NGOs, non-governmental organizations, send in their version of what's actually going on. One of them one year came in from the Council of Native Americans, and that's not an official title, but it was an organization comprised of Native Americans, and they wanted to make sure that the United States didn't impose genetic testing on them, because they didn't want to find out that they were from, like, Mongolia, and that they came across the Arctic, bridge before it was an ocean, and, that they came from someplace else, because it would upset the ways that they look at themselves and the cohesion of their community, particularly their creation stories and association with, blah, blah. I understand that difficulty. And it may be that they've been so imposed upon that, whatever. But I don't think the government's in any danger of imposing genetic testing on them. But there's one group that really doesn't want to have any kind of challenge to their worldview, and that is essentially Islam. I don't know how else to put it. Almost nobody else goes into college fearing that it's going to challenge them to think and rethink and rethink. Are you at Concordia? No, you're at a different school. Yeah, Concordia, I taught critical thinking for 5 years. The first thing I did was give them a book called The Universe Next Door. It's about 8 different worldviews. The goal was to get them to, locate themselves on some kind of grid. This is, what I think. This is the way I put the world, this is the way I understand the world to be. And it was intended to be a challenge. So you've completely gotten away from the university's mission, which is to assist students in learning how to seek truth. That's what it's about at the university. It's not to coddle them and massage them and manage them and therapize them and, that's not a word. But anyway, the therapeutic, the liberationist, and the managerial are the 3 essential coping mechanisms of modernity. They're the ways we manage all this anxiety that comes from pluralization and contractualization and bureaucracy, all those ization words you get in sociology. Well, nobody gets it anymore. I don't know. What are they teaching in that class? But that's what we got, all those ization words. And they're hard things to cope with. We're in the middle of modernity and postmodernity, and we're trying to figure out what is that thing. And so it's hard to figure out. It's hard to get outside of it in order to see into it and discern what it is. So it's, anyway, yeah.
Is it possible to say that the difference in sociological definitions of what hate speech is are due to the different theaters or political structures from those countries? So the United States, we have a democratic republic that encourages structural criticism, where if you go to Russia, we have a federal semi-presidential republic where that is viewed as blasphemy against the structural powers. Do you think you could posit that the political is the source of definition differentials?
Other than calling Russia a republic in any sense, because they are certainly subjects, certainly. Sociologically, that is each place has the way that it views what is and isn't legitimate speech. Yeah. What happened, though, after the second, one slight caveat about the UN. The UN was founded specifically for one reason, to end war, or what we now call armed conflict. That was the goal. They were very hard-headed. Human rights was hardly part of it. There was a little tack on at the end, because Mrs. Roosevelt and others were wanting it to be in the Declaration, or in the treaty, UN Charter. But it was to stop war and to stop violence. How do you stop violence? Well, one of the ways you stop violence is by not telling people what they can't say, because people get really violent about not being able to say what they think. And so there's one group of countries that thinks somehow still they have to manage all that. And there's one, we're rapidly becoming a shrinking minority where we don't believe that, where we think that curbing speech leads to violence. And so, yeah, I see what you're saying about the theaters, but the UN went further than that. And I'm still working on the extent to which I think that's possible. Probably not very, but it's good to be able to chat. I've sometimes likened it to a sort of large PTA. That's parent-teacher organization. I don't know what they call them anymore, but yeah. You had one too?